We're going to begin a discussion of Getting to Yes. This book was written several years ago, and it's never been out of print. It's really changed the way that we think about negotiating and solving disputes. What the authors of Getting to Yes realized is that most of the time when we negotiate, most of us view it as a fight. Maybe a very nice fight, but a fight. And so our ego gets invested in it, and we want to capture more territory. We don't want to give anything up. And the whole process of negotiation tends to focus on what am I getting? What am I giving up? I want to get as much as I can, and that means you give up as much as you can. What Fisher, Urey, and Patton's insight was that the problem with that form of negotiation is you become invested not in the outcome so much of the negotiation, and by outcome I mean achieving your goals, getting what you wanted when you first started the negotiation or had some sort of a dispute. You lost sight of that, and instead you got invested in this position of trying to capture as much territory as you could. These are my words, not the author's, but this is really what they're getting at. And the problem there is that your ego gets invested. You start to see it as, I want to win, and that means you lose. We'll talk later, incidentally, about the fixed pie assumption, which really illustrates this. So the problem with traditional negotiations is that we get more invested in the positions we hold and what we're fearful of giving up than we do into our underlying concerns. The incentive then is that the agreement stalls because people view it as not getting what they want potentially, or giving up something they don't want to give up. So the incentives of that kind of an oppositional bargaining is to stall, to not reach agreements. And that's often what happens. And then the parties haven't really achieved their underlying concerns. Another problem with that positional bargaining is that it has the potential to harm relationships, because underlying it's kind of combative. You're really acting in ways that are pretty aggressive with other people, and so it can endanger those relationships. Also, that the kind of bargaining where you invest in the position rather than looking at the underlying interests, when you want a better position, if you're working with multiple parties, most of our hypotheticals just involve two parties bargaining, but think about all the negotiations where there are many parties, dozens, hundreds, thousands. There's no way to successfully negotiate with that many people, and those of you who've played the game Risk know this, unless you create coalitions. And if you want to win the game Risk, if you ever play that game again, the only way to win is to create alliances and then eventually stab your partners in the back. That's the only way to win. And unfortunately, some people view negotiation in the same way. You get these coalitions who start getting more ego identification with the coalition with whom they belong, and it becomes almost tribal. This isn't solving anyone's underlying issues. Especially, and now think again about the risk to harmonious relationships, especially with friends or with families. We often are reluctant to negotiate, what we view as negotiate, because we don't want to harm those relationships. So instead, we often just give in because we don't want to harm the relationship. And we'll talk some more about that throughout this class, about whether that is helpful in achieving a healthy relationship and a happy relationship with your family and with your friends. So it illustrates the fact that some people's response to hard bargaining, because they're sort of repulsed at the gamesmanship of it, they're repulsed at the aggressiveness of it, they're fearful that relationships might be harmed because of it. The, the combination of all those factors mean that for some people, the response to hard bargaining is what the authors call soft bargaining. They're just more likely to be conciliatory. They give in. They say it's fine. Let's just move on. If you approach things as a soft bargainer, you lose as well, because again, you're not addressing what your underlying interests are and seeing if you can reach an agreement that satisfies those interests. So what the authors of Getting to Yes have done is to come up with a different strategy so that we can avoid the ego investment that loses sight of what our real concerns are. The first part of this approach is separate the people involved in the negotiation from the problem. Start there. Part two is, rather than focusing on your positions, what you want, what you're giving up, focus on the underlying interests. Yes, this is your position. This is how much you want to pay for the car. But underlying that, what is your interest? What would you like achieved? The third part of their approach is to start exploring what options do we have that would achieve our mutual gains. If you separate the people from the problem and explore what your various interests are together, so that you sort of examine, what am I trying to get out of the negotiation? And the other parties do as well. You might come up with some solutions that create mutual gains. There may be concessions you can make that are very low cost to you, but very high value to somebody else. And they in turn might be willing to trade something different, so that people aren't just giving up and feeling like losers or attacked in such a negotiation, but instead there really can be some mutual gains. And finally, the fourth standard is to insist that there be some result based on an objective standard. It helps to separate the people from the problem if you can have some sort of external guideline of what would a fair result look like. Now, these four steps of the solution, as the authors see it, are going to be explored in this book in separate chapters. And so we'll talk more about all of them. The authors are encouraging us to engage in a lot of analysis, diagnose the situation, get more information. Don't start with what your presumptions were or your biases were. Try to get rid of the emotions, clear up the communications in emotionally neutral ways. Start engaging with people simply to uncover what their interests are, not in argument, not in attack, not in defensiveness. The second part is planning, and here you're going to implement the four elements of the game as the authors talk about it. When you discuss these four elements, you're going to see that there are differences in perception, that people will sometimes have frustration, fear, defensiveness, anger. Many people have difficulty in communicating without emotion or communicating clearly, sometimes because they themselves aren't quite sure what their interests are. The goal here is for everyone to clearly understand the other party's interests, not just because that's the kind thing to do, although it certainly is, but because it creates more successful relationships and more successful negotiations. Okay, in subsequent